California Falconers podcast is Matt Mullenix. And the first thing I usually like to talk about with Falconers is to understand where you came from, how you got into falconry. Can you tell us a little about your origin story?
Yeah. So I started when I was about 13 years old, high school. I'm an Army brat. Dad was in the infantry Army, and we were stationed in Panama, Republic of Panama in Central America. I came home from school one day and shooed a bunch of kids away from a baby screech owl that had fallen from its nest in a palm tree, and took it home just like I had taken home every other critter that I could find since I was born. Strangely, there was something about a bird of prey that I could tell immediately was fundamentally different to me. I had liked snakes and lizards and even other birds, but this was the first experience I had with a predatory bird. And even though it was a baby owl, it resonated with me immediately. I got in with a local group of wildlife rehabilitators there in Panama at the time. This would have been 83 or so. There were no laws. I mean, basically they said, look, if you make a pet out of this, we'll never talk to you again. If you let us teach you how to take care of it and raise it up and let it go, we'll give you another one. And so that was, the best advice I could have had at that time. And fortunately I took it. I let them teach me how to do it, and we raised that thing up. I fell in love with it, and I cried when we let it go. But they immediately gave me some new ones, and even at that point, raising the next little brood of baby owls in the bathroom, I was already reading falconry books. I was like trying to put little hoods on the owls' heads with a little cut in a sock, and it was super ridiculous. But I somehow I'd already known that was the direction that I wanted to go in. And a couple of months later, the guy that led this little group said, "Hey, look, we got a broadwing hawk, migratory bird has come down." Well, one of us, it was bred up here, but it was in its first year going through the Isthmus of Panama. And down there in the fall, they just make rivers of raptors. I mean, you can look up and you can see horizon to horizon, broadwinged hawks and Swainson's hawks and turkey vultures in these great, highways. Anyway, unsurprisingly, many of them fall out of the sky. They starve to death, et cetera. This was one of those. So that was my first falconry bird per se. I trained it with a couple of books that I had taken from the library. One of them I still have in my own library. Never found its way back to the library. So you're basically using this sort of crude technique of reading books that are 200 years old and from Great Britain and using leather from chopped up sofas and trying to figure it out on your own. But amazingly, that broadwinged hawk, which by the time I was done with it, had broken feathers and was sort of a mess. We actually hunted a type of robin down there called a clay-colored robin, which was essentially like our robins here, but they're very tame and they lived in the neighborhood and you walk right up to them, which for me it was perfect. And I remember the first flight. So I got up to a group of these clay-colored robins. They sort of scattered away from me, and I just winged this thing, and it flew down into a ditch, went under a big hibiscus, and disappeared. And I crawled in under my belly, and I remember being under this canopy of hibiscus, gigantic flowers and sun coming down through, and there was my broadwinged hawk, plucking this clay-colored robin underneath it. It is a life-changing, experience for me. So, and I never looked back. I knew it then. At that point, I was hooked. And I wish I had a picture of myself then. I had this ridiculous straw hat that was my hawking hat, and I had this straw purse basically that was my hawking bag, and I just didn't care. I was doing what I love to do. So that's how I got started. I came up to the States. I found out that you needed a permit and a sponsor, and at that point it was a state and federal joint process. And I found a wonderful sponsor, Rick Schomburg in Georgia, Columbus, Georgia, and Rick, basically, broke all the stuff that I had down and said, "Hey, look, this is how you really do it. I could see that you were winging it for a little bit, and this is how things are really work." And that was invaluable. And fortunately, he was a good hawker, and so immediately I saw a game get caught and was reinforced in the notion that game should be caught, and that that this is essentially what hawks are for. And so it was a great grounding. From there, another fortunate thing, Rick Schomburg was sort of an informal student of Tom and Jennifer Colson, who at that time were in New Orleans. So when I was 15, Rick would pick me up and we'd drive to New Orleans twice a year, and not only have great experience of New Orleans at night. In the daytime, we'd basically hunt in New Orleans East with Tom and Jen, just fantastic falconers. And so that was kind of these were the people who were early influencers in my own falconry and remain today, big influences. Tom and Jen introduced me to the works of Harry McElroy, who became, somebody I corresponded with later and did, go out and hunt with and have emulated, for years. So this core group of people who were very influential to my falconry today just luckily fell into place.
That's pretty amazing. That's basically like having a group of the legends as your
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it almost would be easier today to do that because they're all accessible. Even Harry has a Facebook account. And Tom and Jen have books that they sell, and they're very accessible people. A lot of the big name falconers that I recognized when I was coming up are still practicing falconry today, and more accessible now than they ever were back then. I literally wrote letters to people, and that was kind of the state of the art, letters. And then finally, when the NAFA phone list would come out once a year, you had phone numbers for people.
That's awesome.
Anyway, yeah, a different time, but got lucky and fell in with a good group of people.
So you started out with a broadwing hawk. What did you move on to from there when you started?
Well, my first bird was a very, very small Kreider's hawk, not much bigger than the broadwing. In fact, when I trapped it, I took it to my sponsor and told him I didn't really know what it was. It ended up flying at about 580 grams.
Whoa.
Which I still haven't heard of a smaller red-tailed than that, but that's what it was. It trapped it at like 610 grams. But I flew it not terribly successfully. And then I had another red-tail the next season after that. That was really my first real hunting bird, the one that I really cut my teeth on, and that was a red-tail named Goblin. That was a fantastic squirrel hawk and worked well with my dog that I had picked up in the meantime, and really taught me how it's done, how hunting is done. And everybody has that first hawk that they had, which is memorable forever. But you also have the first hawk that actually worked and made you feel like a real falconer. That was the first hawk that caught something in front of somebody else, which was a huge shot in the arm for a young falconer. And then, one that catches game at meets, one that catches game every afternoon when you get off the school bus and, you're running up to the mew and letting the hawk and the dog go. I could hunt in my backyard and had a circuit basically for miles that made a big circle back to the house and through really prime hardwood squirrel bottom land. And so that was, so by the time I graduated from high school, I felt like I was the real deal. I obviously had a lot to learn at that time, but I did feel like some big stuff.
Yeah. That's awesome. What, so red tails, kestrels, you've done quite a few. Can you describe the process of how your falconry has evolved over the years?
Yeah. So I went, let me say, I mean, I credit the first that first experience in Panama with the first hawk is really fundamental. I mean, I've never lost interest in hunting small birds with hawks, and even to some extent hunting, neighborhoods. Frankly, I mean, it's still something I kind of do today. So I don't know whether it's just because I've lived in neighborhoods and that's where I hunt. But that was certainly my first imprinted, experience. But I went through the same process almost all young falconers do. I tried to fly everything. I tried to, I flew other broad-winged hawks. I flew red-shouldered hawks. I flew, I at least trained a sharp shin that came my way. Odds and ends, people give you an extra bird. Harris hawks early, obviously a big influence with Ricky and Tom and Jen and all the people in Louisiana that they introduced me to, which, these are hardcore Harris hawkers. So that was also an early, a light bulb moment, how great a Harris hawk is. And from people who just were unapologetic about how great they are. I mean, there was just no question that it was like the greatest bird. And so that's how I learned it without ever having to relearn that. But it was down in Louisiana when I was visiting from Georgia as a kid that I saw the local falconers flying, Harris hawks during normal hunting time, and then on the way back into from the field they would fly kestrels, and that was just like a bombshell for me. I mean, I'd never even heard of it. And people here had been doing it for a long time already before I started. And extremely successfully. So they would be filling their pockets full of starlings, and it just didn't seem possible until I went out with somebody, and then they had some little kestrel that was just whacking starlings left and right, and everybody said, "Yeah, that was great. It's a good one you got this year, but not as good as the one you had last year." Just so it was so ingrained in the culture of these people who like to hunt so much, and that to me gave them a lot of credit in my eyes. Hey, if somebody likes Harris hawks, and Harris hawks are obviously great, these same people are like really big on kestrels. Mm-hmm. So I knew that was going to be in my future. And as I left high school and went to college, it became super convenient as a apartment dweller, serial apartments and dorms, that you needed a smaller hawk, one that could fit in with a weird schedule. And so for about 10 years after that point, I flew, mostly kestrels. From that, the sort of the meat of the kestrel book experience was kind of laid down at that point. And I had mostly kestrels until my kids were born in 2000. And my wife said, I think the hawks in the house need to go. We had twin girls. We had enough trouble as it was just inside the house to deal with. I wanted to keep hunting small birds, but I had to have something that could survive outside and thrive outside. And so I went to male Harris hawks, just because I knew what even then I think a lot of people didn't know, didn't have much experience with, is how good a male Harris hawk is on small birds also. And so that was the perfect segue for me. And then for 22 years, I flew mostly male Harris hawks at small birds and rabbits also, obviously. But their key feature was they could live outside, and still do well.
That makes a lot of sense. I still can't say that I hear a lot of people talking about hunting Harris hawks on birds, but that might be more of a California thing, that we have enough jackrabbits and bunnies that seems to be what you hunt with Harris hawks for the most part, except for the occasional pheasant that comes through.
Right. Well, so an early clue for me was McElroy's work. And of course, the Desert Hawking series, he essentially, poses, two great quail hawks, Cooper's hawks and Harris hawks until he found Diplomatos, and then he's got three great quail hawks. I mean, here's a guy who could not really decide which one was best. And when you hear somebody like Harry McElroy say, "Hey, look, Harris hawks are better footers than Cooper's hawks in cover." I mean, it catches more with Harris hawks than with Cooper's hawks. It just sort of turns the narrative on its head. And you can't, now I know why it works so well. Now, not to take anything away from Cooper's hawks or any other hawk for that matter. Every hawk is great. That's my, mantra. But a Harris hawk learns, and they're just relentless, and all the nonsense that you have to deal with other species of hawks just don't even exist with a Harris hawk. So you're left with this sort of raw, molten, hunting capacity with the Harris, and you can do a lot with it. And he'd been doing it with it a long time. In fact, so Harry, I read an article by Harry that was in one of the British journals back in the 60s before I was born, where he talks exclusively about, hunting small birds with male Harris hawks. And that must have been at that time just unbelievable claim to do. But clearly they're fantastic at it. I can tell you, as anybody can who's got experience with it, they catch exactly the same species that a Cooper's hawk does. So whatever you would like to hunt with a Cooper's hawk, you can hunt it with the male Harris hawk. And without having, the husbandry and management challenges that a lot of Cooper's hawks can give you. You don't have to be a great falconer, frankly, to do a lot of the same stuff. And that's, I think, criticism in a lot of ways of the Harris hawk for a lot of people. But for me, it's a huge benefit. Anyway, you just get to hunt. If you like to hunt small birds, you get to hunt small birds, and you don't have to worry about the other stuff. So I did that, but now we kick the kids out. They're in college. Sort of the worm is turned now, and now I got my library set up for small hawks again, and started flying small hawks a couple of years ago. And so I'm sort of back to where I started.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about your writing. That's probably with how people know you best is, well, the 4 falconry fundamentals more recently, but putting the Kestrel on the map again, really. Let's talk about that book and what led you to write it.
Well, so it had very humble beginnings, I can tell you. I wrote an article for the Tail Feathers, which was the Florida club journal. And I think I was editor at the time. So I had some, editorial discretion to put my own work in there. And I think I had a total of 3 Kestrels at the time, something like that. And I stitched together this few-page article that just essentially framed out what the book would become, with longer pieces and more experience. And I added things that I valued in other falconry books that had been influential to me. So Maverick Godato's Hawk for the Bush, and E.B. Mitchell's Art and Practice. These were books that and of course everything by Harry McElroy. So I used sort of Harry McElroy's sort of personal writing style, trying to make things as simple as possible for the reader. I put in charts and data because I really valued that as an apprentice. I still value it today tremendously. Even writers like Mitchell who could have been excused for just writing text, but they took the effort to put the graphs in there, to put the actual numbers in there, so that you knew you had something to go on. 200 years later, you actually can know what an individual bird did over the course of a 2-month season or a 3-month season. It does give you a toehold into what is actually possible. So I knew that anything I wrote I was going to emulate that, and I hope that I credited it well enough in the introduction that, look, first of all, I didn't invent Kestrel falconry. I heard about it, in hawking with Louisiana falconers. who had been doing it for years. And then when I researched it, people had been doing it, longer than that. Kestrels have always been good birds, it turns out. Anybody who happened to stumble upon one and, showed it a sparrow, it got a flight. So, so I didn't invent that. The style and the content were modeled after my heroes that I grew up with in the books, with a huge dose of what Tom and Jen Coulson, took for granted about how falconry works and what's important to say. And then it started with a small publisher. We made a little paperback version of it. And then it went from there to Western Sporting, and we've revised it, 2 or 3 times. I think it's been continually in print now since 1997. And it's considerably expanded. My friend Steve Hine made great illustration for it, pencil sketches, and I'm super grateful to him. I'm in a position now where a great falconer who I admire, and I see him, once a year or so, and I won't name him here, but he told me that this was his first falconry book, and that it really inspired him to get into it, which is crazy to think that, here's somebody who's he's a master falconer in his own right. He's very polished. He practices a very high, technical falconry, and he read my book first, and it makes me feel like 1,000 years old. But I still feel like the 15-year-old that was super excited to see a harris hawk. And it doesn't seem like that long ago to me. So that's been a huge benefit to me to know that book has had had an impact, and I hear that a lot. Fortunately, people are very generous in their remarks and generous in their sharing with me how influential it was to see that this bird that they thought was super cool could actually be used for something.
Well, I have to say, I've definitely heard a lot of apprentice falconers from California who start with the Kestrel and start with that book. So, it's definitely not a regional thing. We have a lot of people starting with your book as the first foray into falconry.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing to hear, and it's a wonderful thing to know. I feel like, and we talked about this earlier. I mean, that's your legacy right there. To me, I feel like I can kind of coast now. I mean, I know I'll keep being interested in things and keep writing about them, because that's kind of how I respond to being interested in something. Is I try to write about it and figure it out while I'm writing about it, and share it and figure it out while you're sharing it. It's a process. And I'll always do that. I hope I always have an opportunity to do that. But I know if falconry ended for me tomorrow, there would be a part of the falconry that I contributed to that will go on. One thing I'd like everybody to know is that everything I write is sort of has an antecedent, right? Like it has a history. It's it's not made from whole cloth. If I figured out a way to combine it or say it in a new way, great. But the stuff has been around for a long time, and I would recommend everybody, read the Coulsons, read Harry McElroy, read Maverick Gradato, read Mitchell. Mm-hmm. Go back to the source and start there, and you will see how closely the connection follows. And that again, that makes me feel great that it's having an impact.
Yeah, and so you kind of. So let's talk about the 4 falconry fundamentals next. That book seems different to me than any other falconry book that I've read, because, you go a lot broader into what falconry is and what makes up good falconry than you get unless you have like the big NAFA tomes.
Right.
But those obviously dive into really specific details. What drove you to write in such broad strokes?
Well, I'll tell you, and I tried to sort of cue up the book with the story of how it was written and why it was written. it's the experience, I think, of every falconer who's been around for a little while and has made himself or herself accessible, that they'll get calls and emails and now, direct messages and Facebook connections, et cetera, with people who recognize that you might know something about a thing that they're interested in, or might have a solution for a problem that they're having. And so, like a lot of people, I've gotten calls like that over the years on a pretty regular basis. And what that shows you is that, while the experience of falconry is highly individual for the person who does it, there are broad patterns, and those patterns are not accessible to you because you don't talk to a bunch of people, right? But if you are the sort of the recipient of essentially the same phone call, every single time, people do not have a zillion different problems with hawks. That becomes clear just from the volume of phone calls that you get about what prevents somebody from actually getting a hawk that they have trained, onto the back of an animal that they are hunting. Like that. That's the essence of falconry is that you go out into the field and the hawk flies away from you and toward something that's running or flying away, and it catches it, right? And then you collect it. This is sort of basic, but a lot of ways to sort of veer off from that, kind of seems like a straight line, but people go off into these eddies, and we all do, right? And if you don't have somebody to kind of keep you back on track, well, to tell you, well, that's, maybe not important, and that's not important. Here's what's really important to get you to that one particular goal, which is, an animal in your bag. And that's not the only goal in falconry, obviously. It's not, that is not the everything that falconry is, but falconry cannot exist without that. And I think essentially everybody wants that to happen. Everybody sort of instinctively knows that if that doesn't happen, this really isn't falconry, right? Like falconry is other things for certain, but if without that, it isn't falconry at all. And so you might come up with 6 fundamentals, right? Any of my mentors might come up with 3 fundamentals. Like it was a little bit arbitrary. And when you read the book, you see I kind of fudged a little bit because I put 4 other ones sort of in between the 4 main ones because they all kind of segue into each other. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the way I think about it now is that while you learn a lot from other falconry books, a lot of detail, like fine detail from other falconry books, it turns out that the width of the jesses, or the width of the cuts that you make in the jess to make it round so that it doesn't hurt the foot of the bird, that how many millimeters that is never amounts to why you catch something or why you don't catch something. The minutia are icing on the cake, and in fact the really important things are more fundamental than that. And so having an idea already and having had this conversation with more experienced falconers for years and years, we always come around to, well, you got to start with the prey base. Like you don't have enough game. You don't have falconry. Falconry cannot exist without game. How much game? A lot of game, a ton of game, way more game than you think you need. Like, because your bird's only going to take, 20% of every good slit, maybe. So you need the extra, 80% to be there and to be readily accessible, and not just in that field, because that field's going to get developed tomorrow. You need 6 other fields, right? So you get these crushing realizations that what really works in falconry is it's a volume game. It's a numbers game. You need a lot of game. You need a lot of slits, right? Because you could have a lot of game, but not every animal that runs away from you is a good slit. Good slips have a shape and so that's where, all of this came from. It's the thing that we say to each other. It's the thing that we eventually learn about falconry. It's the thing that we reflect on at home when you've caught something about why that worked today and why it didn't work yesterday. Mm-hmm. But nobody had written it down per se. I mean, these fundamentals exist in every good falconry book. You can find them. You can find it by some other name, by some other process. Everything that works in 4 falconry fundamentals is in is in other good falconry books, but for a phone conversation, it's way simpler. And so part of the inspiration for writing it was I wanted it to be short. I wanted to use very few words and short words. I wanted to have as few fundamentals as I could, with still providing all the information you needed to catch something with a hawk. And then I wanted to provide it cheaply, so that when somebody called, I could say, hey, look, for $3.99, you can get the Kindle edition of this thing. Read it. It'll take you an hour and 15 minutes to read it, if that. Call me back. And that way, you and I will have the same vocabulary. We'll say, okay, when I say prey base, let's talk about that first. Do you have starlings where you are? How many do you see? Do you see them all day? And then we can talk about, basically we just go around the clock face of the rubric. And you and I will get there a lot faster if we both, start off on the same place. So, yeah. So that's it. That's longer than the book, actually, that whole description.
What's great about it is they always say the great ideas are the ones that once they're out there, you're like, oh yeah, why wasn't that there before? That's kind of what the 4 Falconry Fundamentals felt like to me after I read it. I was like, why haven't I read a book like this? It makes sense. I would have expected it to exist before, but it's great that now it does. We actually use it. For those of you California falconers who hang out with me at dinners and meets, if you're a new prospective falconer, come to me and I will give you a copy of the book, because that's generally, it's the best primer that I've found for people new to falconry, and one that will kind of grow with you through whatever kind of falconry you do. So.
Well, it's a very generous, wonderful thing to hear, and I'm just glad. I'm glad it resonates. My goal, and this is a little grandiose, maybe, but I do have a sense that we have not taught falconry the right way for a long time, and it's a big claim, because we've been teaching falconry for thousands of years, right? Like we. Much smarter people than me, better falconers than myself, have taught falconry and have produced volumes of text and video that really describe excellent methods of practicing falconry and learning falconry. So I don't say this without understanding that fact, but I do sincerely believe that we teach it. We don't start in the right place, essentially. Our focus is on the birds, and our focus is on the birds because the birds are our first love. They're what really draw us to the sport. Yeah. But in fact, the birds are not the first thing that makes falconry work. And so if regardless what bird you have, there is an important thing that happens before the bird, and that's what are you going to hunt and how much of it do you have? And I think we say to each other, oh, we make sure that you understand that as an apprentice, but I don't think we really do, because the apprentice comes to you and says, oh my God, this red-tailed is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Or I really want, what I really want is an Applemata falcon, or what I really want is a Merlin. I can't wait till I get a Merlin. We're like, yeah, I get it, because they're great. They're awesome. But the truth is, there's no point in even thinking about what birds you get until you know where you live and what lives there and how much of it do you have. And then if you start there, then the rest of it sort of falls in place. And so I hope that like the Kestrel book, was a way for people to understand something new and practical about this very common species. I mean, I really hope that for this book, it's a great entry point for people to understand where to start thinking about falconry, so that with the least amount of steps and the least amount of heartache and trouble, they'll at least be able to catch game, which is not, like I say, not the end of falconry. It's the beginning of falconry, right? It's a practical, experienced, pretty good apprentice falconer ought to be able to catch game. And we should not hide that from them. We should not prevent them from doing that. that's a starting point, right? Like that's where you begin. And I think that's an achievable goal for every serious-minded apprentice falconer.
Yeah. So I kind of want to shift now. One of California falconers' fundamentals is conservation and falconry. We believe that the other big thing to falconry is taking care of both the environment that we hunt and the birds that that we love. And you have done some conservation work yourself. You just recently did a banding trip. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So through Jennifer Colson, who's a PhD wildlife biologist, I was introduced to one of the researchers with the RedTailed Hawk Project, which you see online now. It's sort of a national effort among a variety of raptor biologists to figure out what it means to be a red-tailed hawk and why they're so variable and where all the varieties come from, and are they actual varieties, or are they just different random colors? I mean, we think we know about all this stuff. In fact, from a scientific standpoint, we really don't know until you trap the birds and take blood from them and put radios on them and send them back out and see where they end up. And so the premise of this work that they do is essentially the same premise of all science, is to figure out what it is that we think we know and how much more do we need to know that we don't. I just volunteered for a weekend. I went and set up camp close to where I knew that they were going to try to trap some birds, and went around with a guy and was basically a field monkey for him. It helped him throw the trap out the window and hold the birds while they put bands on them, et cetera. But this work was familiar to me, and is and I have some experience in it. We're right out of college. I worked for Brian Millsap in Florida for 3 years as essentially a field tech on a Cooper's hawk project that he has continued to this day to pursue now in New Mexico. But in Florida, for the first 3 years out of college, I got up 4 every morning and got in a game commission truck and started tracking Cooper's hawks around the countryside, and went to bed after dark when the Cooper's hawks went to bed. And so I got a lot of experience, trapping birds and putting harnesses on them and triangulating. This was even before a lot of the technology that is helpful today. The stuff that I saw a couple of weekends ago being deployed, none of that had been developed yet at that time. So we were making point locations by putting a compass on a map and triangulating radio signals, et cetera. We were walking in to collect feathers after a presumed capture in the wild, just to figure out what it was that they caught. And it was very hands-on field biology. I'm glad I left it, because I would still be doing that today without a biology degree. I'd be like this bum living on somebody's couch, having a great time but not making much of myself. So right. But it was a formative experience. It has colored my falconry. Thinking about the hawks that I have as biological, entities, as parts of the ecology, as functional, pieces in the great wheel of the world that we live in. That's a perspective that never goes away. You put a harness on a Cooper's hawk and you watch where it goes across, its territory, and you see where it catches the baby blue jays that it feeds its own young. You get a sense that these creatures that live in our houses and in our mew have a whole other life out in the wild, and they have a relevance out there, and they interact with each other out there. They're not just something that exists as soon as you trap it, right? Like, you think as a falconer, the bird sort of begins when you get your hands on it. And the truth is, you just harvested one, is what you've done. The real bird lives out there, and it behooves you to figure out how much of that is what you've got in your hands, and what it does out there. How can that inform what it can do for you and can do with you? And it just, I would just encourage every falconer to volunteer for a weekend, to to help a biologist in the field doing something with hawks, even if it's just taking measurements or just sitting down and talking to them, helping them compile notes or data or whatever it is that they need. Go do it. It's good. It's good politics. It's good experience, and it'll teach you a lot that will inform your falconry.
Yeah, I think it gives you a wider appreciation for birds of prey overall than falconry can.
Yes. Yeah. It's always interesting to me to note the differences between what categories falconers have for different hawks and what categories taxonomists and biologists have for different hawks. And so part of the fun of the weekend was just chatting with the guy as we were driving around about sort of, you realize that falconers, we've got a lot of crazy notions about how things actually work, and we're probably right about a lot of things, either by accident or by inference or by our imagination. We probably know some things that biologists will never know or never know for certain because their methodology is much more rigorous than ours, right? But the insight that falconers have is super valuable to any raptor biologist, and you'll find a lot of raptor biologists, especially my generation and older, they were falconers to begin with, and a lot of sort of field biology really, it's about hunting, it's hunting skills. It's and the raptor biology is a lot of falconry skills. I would say probably there are generations after mine where they may not have had that experience and may have a different perspective on what raptor biology is all about. But there's a lot of falconers in it and a lot of falconry to it. So again, I just would recommend everybody try to do something. I guess I would say the same thing with wildlife rehabilitation, which is obviously not biology. It's a different aspect, but also one in which falconry skills and techniques are critical. Obviously, falconers' familiarity and comfort with birds of prey, individual birds of prey in the hand, super valuable. And I have here, very sort of copacetic relationship with the wildlife rehabilitator. Is not the classic, falconry versus rehabber, experience that you hear about. There's a lot of mutual respect, which is really nice. And so I've volunteered to take individual birds and do what I can with them for release. And again, it gives you a different perspective on your falconry birds. It helps you understand, a lot more about how they work and why they break and how they might be fixed. And, some very practical information for any falconer. So in the same way that I would recommend anybody volunteer to join a research study of some kind, also at least once in your falconry career, make a friend with a rehabber and help them put a bird back in the wild. Just good experience.
Yeah, that's some great wise words. Well, that actually wraps up basically everything that I wanted to talk about. Do you have any other closing words?
Well, I just want to thank you for your interest and for the opportunity to talk, especially about the books and my own history, and to tell you that I've enjoyed meeting you and watching you online and watching your falconry, and hope we've got an opportunity to meet in person at some point.
Absolutely. It would be awesome to have you out in California, or hopefully at some point I'll be down over there where you are. For those California falconers listening, I'm going to go ahead and link Matt's books. I highly, highly recommend them. They're going to, especially if you're starting with a kestrel, grab the kestrel book. And everybody needs 4 falconry fundamentals, whether you're starting or a senior falconer, I guess you can call it. Well, thanks again, Matt. It was great to talk to you.
All right. Until next time.